all these little system and components process these assets together to allow designers and artists to put them together. The last note on this is that like code-wise, the engine was written in C++. So this means that if you're working with Unreal, you can use any language between C++, Blueprint, which is a visual scripting tool, which really is like C++ functions represented as nodes, like boxes that you can connect together with wires, which sound a bit dumb, but you see next week when we talk about it that it's actually extremely powerful. And you can also since a few versions ago, use Python to script the editor. Any question so far? Sorry, I can't see the Discord. Okay. All right. So was that here as in you have a question or you? Okay, I'm gonna get that. Okay. All right. So this is when we're gonna start actually making something, because nobody wants to hear me talk for 2 hours. So this is how you create a new project. I'm assuming most of you can start the editor. If anyone has the engine and doesn't know how to start the editor, please let me know right now, and I will show you how. You know what? I'm going to show you how anyway. So there's actually a few different ways. If you have the Epic launcher, right? Can you guys see the launcher on my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, you basically just go to Unreal Engine here, library, and it's going to show you all the engine versions you have installed. You're also going to be able to see your projects, the My Projects section. So you either double click on your project here, or if you're making a new project, you just click. Usually when you install it, it also makes a shortcut on the desktop. That's basically it. You see that once it's finished loading, you're gonna get to this window over here. So this is what I'm talking about on the slide. So there's a few options on the new project, especially since 4.24. They've kind of changed how you make a new project. It used to be just one window with not that many options, but now there's actually quite a few options. So the first window allows you to choose the type of project. You can choose between like games or like film, virtual production kind of project, or you can go architecture and product design mostly. Yeah, so they're trying to like diversify these days. So it's not just for games anymore. It's also for like you can do movie. If you guys have watched The Mandalorian, the Star Wars TV show, that was shot basically almost 100% with Unreal. There was actually no green screen in that show. There was basically a gigantic screen in the background, and the whole environment was like a 3D environment in real time that was controlled. So you can do quite a lot of stuff now, not just games. Anyway, back to the project. You just select the category, and then once you've selected game, you're offered with like a bunch of templates. Templates are pretty cool because they're gonna save you quite a lot of time if you're making a new game. And let's say you know the genre of game that you're making. By selecting like third person, it's basically gonna get you started with like a character controller, a camera, a bunch of animation, and that's already gonna be made for you. So you can save quite a lot of time by selecting a template. But if you're making a game that's a bit exotic and doesn't really fit into any of these categories, then you can select blank, and you'll basically have nothing, and you can create your own controller from scratch. And then the last window, project settings, is where you can select kind of like the quality and things like that. The first important option is you can choose if your project is going to be blueprint based or C++ based. Um, you can change that at any time down the line, but it's kind of nice to know from the beginning if you're going to be blueprint only, because it's going to move a bunch of code stuff that you won't need, and it's actually going to make it a bit faster because it won't be recompiling. And then if you're making a mobile game, for example, or like VR game platform that doesn't have much performance, then these two things here, the desktop console and mid maximum quality, is where you would reduce the target hardware quality so that it can be scalable. And then of course, don't worry too much about ray tracing right now because it's still kind of like a beta feature. And you can add starter content if you want. Starter content is basically a bunch of assets, meshes, sounds, stuff like that to get you started. Basically that. Is there any question? Am I going too quickly, or are you guys all right?
You're good.
Yeah. So we're getting to our first follow along section. What I'm gonna do is, if you guys have the engine, try to follow along, and then I'm gonna try to basically do the same thing at the same time. I'll put the slides online after the lecture. Um, right now, if you can just watch the screen. Yeah. Okay, so let's just try and make a new project. If you guys have the engine, try and follow along. So you just basically select game. You see the criteria on the left side here. Okay. Let's make a game project. We're gonna go third person because we're gonna be using that character a bit later on. And we're gonna choose blueprint. We're not looking at code yet. Desktop quality, maximum quality here. We want to add starter content. It's important because we're going to be using some of the meshes and sounds in there. And then we're going to disable ray tracing. Pick a folder that makes sense for you. Give it a name, whatever you want, and then create the project. I'm gonna call that whatever. Sweet. And then click the create project. It's going to be loading for a little bit. Is everyone all right? So far, so good. Shouldn't be too hard, should it?
Yep.
Yeah, cool. All right, so now we're in the engine. That's the editor right here. Yeah, so now back presentation. Let's have a quick look at the interface. So if you look in your editor, you should be seeing something similar to that screenshot here. See that, right? There's quite a few sections. I'm just gonna go quickly over it because really all you want to know is the name of each section and kind of what they do roughly. The top here is the menu bar. This section right there with all the big buttons is called the level editor. Level editor toolbar is where you have all your like common functions like save. If you connect to source control like GitHub or Perforce, this is where you can quickly integrate with your source control, and then you can, push or submit directly from the editor. You don't even need to use Perforce or GitHub or like the external software. Yeah, and then settings, but we'll get back to that a bit. Number 3 on the left is what we call the modes panel. This is where you can switch between different kind of like editor mode. So you can see right now I'm like placement mode, where I can just place a bunch of different objects. But there's also a bunch of other modes like painting mode here, landscape mode, start creating terrains, foliage mode to paint um, trees and grass and stuff like that, and geometry editing. Yeah, we look at that a bit. Number 4 here is what we call the content browser, and that's basically going to be where all your assets live. This basically kind of shows you the folder of your project. If you go in Windows and then you look at your project folder, it's basically the same kind of hierarchy. But this is going to show you every asset you have. It also allows you to create new assets and import assets in the projects. In the middle here, number 5, that's your main viewport. It's basically where you navigate in the space. When you want to add an asset, you can just drag and drop it from the browser directly in the viewport. Six is what we call the world outliner. If you used Unity in the past, I think that's called property panel. Whatever. It's pretty similar. So this basically shows you every object in your scene right now. So you see like these chairs and tables be listed somewhere here. So it's every actors in the world. Yeah. Number 7, the details panel, shows you the properties for the objects that you have selected. So it's pretty common kind of interface. To navigate the viewports, you have a few different options. Feel free to try that along as I'm showing you, by the way. So yeah, you have kind of 3 different main modes. You have the WASD mode, which is basically the same as when you're playing any video game. You just move with WASD while holding the right mouse button, and then you move the mouse to look. So it's exactly like playing a game, except that you're holding the right mouse button. The second mode is by dragging. So you can just basically hold the left mouse button and then drag, which is going to move forward, backward. Actually, I'm going to show you in it. Here. So if you look at my viewport right now, I'm holding the right mouse button and then moving the mouse, I can move around. And then using the keyboard WASD, I can kind of move forward and sideways. So that's the first mode. Second mode, dragging. Here I'm just holding the left mouse button, which allows me to go forward, backward. And then if I go to left, right, look left and right. If I hold the right mouse button, I can look up and down, also look left and right. And if I hold the left and the right mouse button, you can see that now I'm kind of like strafing left and right. That's the second mode. There's also a third mode, which is kind of like if you're used to like 3D software like Max and Maya, it's basically a similar kind of way. You can select an object, and then when you press F on it, you focus on that object. And then if you hold the Alt button and then use the left mouse, it's going to orbit around that object. And then if you do the same, Alt, but then the right mouse button, it's going to zoom in and out. And same if you do Alt with the middle mouse button, then it's just going to pan left, right button. Is that clear enough for everyone? So yeah, have a try and see what you think. Usually the way that most people use is the WS, like the game, traditional game navigation. What I'd like you guys to try, if you have the engine open, see if you can navigate, but also see if you can switch the viewport mode. At the top, you notice there's like a few buttons. Try and experiment with that and see what's available, because that gives us a few important options to show you at the same time. So in that perspective button here, you can switch between perspective and a bunch of different orthographic modes. So orthographic means it's not going to be like 3D, it's more going to be like 2D, like here. This is the top view, bottom view, sideways. The cinematic viewport, but that's a bit for later. If I go back perspective and then click that lead button, Now you can see all the other people. That's kind of going to change the rendering. You can see with no lighting information, see the wireframe, geometry, and a bunch of other um, more advanced view modes. But if you're looking for like, if you're trying to optimize, for example, see complexity of your shaders, this would show you once it's done compiling. You see the scene is pretty good, which means it's optimized. But don't worry about that. Just know that you can change. Is that more or less clear for everyone? All right, let's move on then. So now we're going to create our first level. And creating a level is actually pretty simple. Once again, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. You can either use the menu bar at the top, go File, New Level, or you can do it also through the content browser. In your content browser, you see there's a big Add New button, and you can select level. Or you can also right-click in an empty space in the content browser, which will bring the context menu up, and you can choose level. Once you do that, you'll have a new window that lets you select a template for your level. There's a bunch of different templates, and I think 424 maybe, or 425. Yeah, there's an extra one here called Time of Day, which is a new one that just added to showcase the new feature of like realistic sky atmosphere, time of day that changes. Probably not going to be very useful for you unless you want to check out other features. But basically, the important ones are the default one, which just give you a skybox and a default lighting setup and a ground. VR basic, once again, it's probably not going to be extremely useful for you. It's only if you're testing out a VR headset and you want it already set up and have a few objects to interact with. And then, if you're making a level and you want to customize every single thing, probably want to start with an empty level. These are the options you have. So let's try that. If you have the engine open, try and make a new level, either through the content browser or using File New here. I'm going to try and from here. Let's make a new level. You can see it's creating a level for us, and then always give like a decent name. It's important to decent name for assets. Then you can double click to open it, and you see that here, actually something I should have mentioned. If you use the content browser to create a level, it's not going to ask you which template you want. It's going to create an empty one by default. So maybe for now, use the File New Level menu at the top, so you can choose template. And for now, pick the default template because you want to see something. Okay. So once you have that new level created using the default template, just hit the Save Current button at the top or Control S, and it's going to ask you where you want to save it. So, give it any name, whatever. I'm just going to override the one previously created. There we go. We have our first level. Got a sky, got a ground. But basically the basics of how you create a level. You guys all good? Everyone has a level to start with? Okay.
How did you choose the template?
All right, yeah, so if you use the content browser to create your level, it's not going to show you the template window. So you have to use File New at the top, File New Level, and then you'll have template where you can.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so moving on. Oh yeah, and so now that you have your level, try and play it. You find the play button in the level editor level editor toolbar. It's a shortcut to play. You can find it, it's right here. Basically, when you hit play, it's gonna spawn your character in the middle. You'll be able to. So if you remember when we created that project, we selected this um, third person template. And that's kind of why we did that. So we have a character that we can run. So yeah, so far we have a project, we have a new level, we have a character to play with. Now let's look at what else we can do. The first thing I want to show you guys is what we call BSP. It's basically a geometry kind of format in the editor that lets you create basic primitives, basic shapes that you can then edit and manipulate. So if someone has their mic not muted and it's kind of echoing, you guys all mute your mics, please.
Lisa, I think that's you.
All right. Yeah, so it's basically editable geometry. We use it mostly for prototyping. You probably wouldn't ship a game with that because it's not the most optimized geometry, but it's a really kind of easy and quick way to create basic shapes when you're trying to prototype them. Another important aspect of this geometry is that it's a Boolean type of geometry. What that means is that you can add and subtract geometry together. We're going to look at what this means just in a slide or two. But for now, just want to show you how you can create basic primitives. So if you remember the modes panel, if you make sure that you're in place mode in the mode panel, and then select geometry categories, you can then drag and drop any kind of shape that you want. Drop that in the viewport, and that will create any kind of shape. Editing the geometry, all you need to do is switch to geometry edit mode. So in your mode panel, right here, if you click on that button over there, that looks like a cube, split cube, this is what we call the geometry edit. The shortcut is Shift 5. You like shortcuts. Switch to that, and then you can select any face of that primitive that you've just dropped in the viewport, and then you can manipulate it. You can move it, you can scale it, you can rotate it, you can even extrude faces. So even though it's not as complicated as like 3ds Max or Maya or Blender, you can still create kind of like basic shapes. There's also a pretty cool tool called the pen mode. You see in the menu bar here, if you select the pen option and then switch to a top view, it's not going to work in the perspective. If you switch to top, then you can use Control and right mouse button to add little points called vertex. So you add a vertex everywhere, and then you basically create a shape. And when you're done, you just hit Enter key on your keyboard, and that's going to close the shape. And that shape is going to be extruded, and you have the basic primitive, the shape we've just created. Yeah, so what I meant before by it's a Boolean kind of geometry is that you can add and subtract geometry. By default, when you create a shape, so if you just did it right now and you dropped cube in the viewport, it actually added geometry, right? But you can change the type to subtractive. What it means is that if you can see here I have two primitives, the cylinder and that cube. If I was to change the type of that cylinder to subtractive and then move it into that cube, then I would get this. It would remove the geometry from that cylinder from the cube. If that makes sense. Does that make sense? You guys are good? Question about this?
Yes, I
Mhm.
do have question,
Yep.
as usual. So about Unreal Engine and our next submission, is it a good time to ask question about next submission,
We'll
or
talk.
should I?
We'll talk about submission when we take a break a bit later. So if you don't mind
It's,
keeping that question for a bit later, Sama will
yep.
answer that question.
Thank you.
Cheers. Um, yeah. Any other question about BSP geometry?
Just going back, where do you find the brush that allows you to manipulate it? Other
Right. So
prototype.
yeah, I'll just show you guys in engine. So I'll just switch to the follow along section, and then I'll be able to show you guys exactly. So follow along section, we're gonna try to make our level a little bit better. We're gonna add walls, windows, staircase, and just make it a little bit better than just a stupid floor. So let's jump in engine. I wish I could show you the slides and at the same time. Anyway, jump in there. So to answer your question, were you asking about how to place the geometry or how to edit it?
How to edit it?
All right. So I'll show you that. So to place the geometry, you just grab the geometry from here into the viewport. Once it's in there, you have to switch mode. You see here that button. It says geometry edit. So you click on that button, and now you can see it's switch mode. You can see there's like big squares in every corner. And basically, you just select one of the face by clicking on it, right? And now you can manipulate any kind of face that you select. You can move it, make the cube bigger. You can also scale it. Even a non-uniform scale works, right? And then you
Oh,
can
okay.
also extrude it. So if you look on the left here, you select the extrude option. It's always going to tell you that it works with local. Just ignore that thing. And then once you're in extrude mode, you can move it up, and you can see that it's going to create a new kind of face. That's what we call extruding. It's basically you take a face, push it up, make a new section. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So yeah, that's the edit geometry. I'm just going to delete this one. And so we're going to try and make our level look a little bit better. If you're following along, feel free to make your own kind of layout. You don't have to copy what I'm doing. Just be creative and make a cool level. I'm just going to try and show the basics here. So I've added a new cube. What I want to try and create is like a wall that goes along that. So now that I have, yes, you can snap. So you'll see that by default, it's actually snapping on the grid. So the grid, I haven't shown you that yet, but you can see here at the top, that little thing here, that button allows snapping on the grid or not. By default, it's set to 10 units. Units in Unreal, by the way, are centimeter. So it's like you're moving 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter. You can see how it's kind of snapping here. You can snap to other things by clicking this button here. And there's something called surface snap. You can enable that, right? And when you do, you can see that my cube is kind of like moving around everywhere because it's snapping to any other surface. But because our level right now only have one surface, there's not much for it to snap on. There are other snap options. Try to find them real quick. Yeah, here. So if you click the setting button, um, you have a snapping category, and you can enable a bunch of different snapping options. So you have actor snapping, which means that when you move something, it's going to try to snap to any actor in your level. I think it snaps to the pivot, if I remember correctly. You can snap to a socket. Um, socket is something a bit advanced. I'm not gonna tell you what it is yet. You can enable vertex snapping, which is probably what you're talking about. So if you take the, I don't know if it works with geometry. Oh yeah, so you see as I'm moving it, um, there's like blue vertices that appear sometimes. I don't know if you can find see them. If I select one of these vertices. Might not work with geometry, I think. But if you take just a normal mesh cube. I think it might, yeah, you see it snaps to the closest. Yeah, sadly, it might not be geometry. Or you might have to. Actually, it does. So you can take the whole cube, and if you grab the if you grab it by the pivot, by the white ball here, you see it's going to snap to vertices of the. That answer your question, Hamish? I think there's a few more options, but remember. Cool. All right, so yeah, back to the cube. So yeah, I'm just basically creating a basic cube, and I want it to kind of take the whole length of the wall here. So I can do two things. I can scale it like this. That works. You see that it kind of, when you scale it, it kind of stretches the texture, which is not a problem for now, but I don't really like it when it stretches the texture. So I'm going to undo. Don't do the undo shortcut, by the way. It's Control and Z. I like to kind of use the geometry edit mode to stretch the cube. So switch to geometry editing mode here, clicking this button, and then I select face on the side and just drag it to the edge. And you see that now the texture hasn't been stretched because that's because the geometry is being rebuilt every time I edit. So the UVs, which is basically the way the texture is being tied, is also rebuilt. So there's no stretch. So I have my wall here. I think by default it's 1 meter tall. It's 2 meters. There you go. That's one wall. That's a good opportunity to show you how to like copy stuff. So to duplicate objects in Unreal, you have a few options. You can use the right click menu and go edit duplicate. You see there's also a keyboard shortcut, Control W. So that. Oh, I just hit Control W and you can see I have a new brush here. Cool. That's my second wall. Okay, but you can also duplicate an object. You can also use the little arrows to move it. But if you hold the Alt key as you drag it, it's going to make a copy. So that you select it, hold the Alt key, and then drag it, and that basically makes a copy. Note that it also works with any other gizmo. So you can do it while moving, but you can also do it while rotating. So if I was to hold the Alt key right now and rotate, it would copy that mesh but rotate it. So now I have a few different ways to create copies. But yeah, so now we have 3 walls. Oh, sorry. I'm just trying. Sorry, Discord is. Say the word. Oh, how I make the box into. Okay, sure. Yeah. Let's do it again. So if you start with nothing, basically just go geometry here, take a box, drag and drop it here, right? So to make it a wall, you have 2 options. You can just select that and scale. Oh yeah, I guess scale. So back to basics. By default, the gizmo. So what we call the gizmo is that little 3 arrows thing. So the gizmo allows you to switch between different modes. You have move mode, rotate mode, scale mode. And to switch between these three different modes, you can use the three buttons here at the top. So you see here, I can, right now I'm moving, so they call it translating. It's translate mode. Rotate mode here, right? Scale mode here. You see when I click on a button, the gizmo changes. These all have keyboard shortcuts. So this is moving is W, rotating is E, and scaling is R, W-E-R. So when I'm in the viewport here and I hit W, you can see it switches back to. If I hit R, it switches to scale mode. So I probably should have shown you that. But you see, if I select the cube and then hit the R key on the keyboard, it's going to switch to scale mode. And now I can choose to either scale. So if I put the mouse on the white cube in the middle, it's going to scale every direction at the same time, right? But that's not what I want. I just want to scale this direction. So I can grab that red line. If I just grab red axis, then you see that it's going to scale only in that direction. So that's the first way you can make the wall. You can scale only one direction, up and down and sideways, and you can switch mode, kind of move it up and down. That's the first way. The second way, yes, yes, Neil. Okay, just finish first. Get back to you. So the second way was, if you have your box here, you can use the geometry editing mode to modify the shape of that object. So if you click over here, mode panel, if you click on the geometry editing button at the top, now you see that visuals have changed. It's changed to geometry editing. These big squares that you see at the corner, we call vertex, and then each kind of like side of the cube is what the face. So you can select a face, and once again with the gizmo that I've just shown you, you can move these faces around. So I can select that face here. You see it turns orange, which means I've selected that one face. And I just want to drag that face all the way to the end here. So I just select it, move it all the way right. Oops, messed that up. Right. Sorry. So I move all the way to the right. And then if I go to the other side, I can select this one face here. And once again, use the red arrow, move it only in one direction, left. Right? And so if I do the same with every faces, move them only in one direction, you can see that I'm kind of shifting. Does that answer your question, Reese? All right, awesome. So Neil, if you want to increase the size of an object without stretching the texture, no, that's the only way. It's a bit complicated. We'll talk about it a little bit after that. But it's basically the way that materials and textures are being applied to meshes. Right now, this is a special kind of geometry. It's BSP. It's not the same as a normal mesh. You can see a normal mesh here. If I go back to the edit mode, and in the basic category, there's cube here. It's not the same cube as the box in geometry. So if I go into basics and cube, you can see that the tooltip tells us that this is a static mesh actor. So it's a mesh. It's not pure geometry you can edit. When I drag this cube, you can see that I can't select any of the face. If I switch to geometry mode here, it's not going to work with this mesh because this mesh is a mesh that's been made in another software. It's been made in 3ds Max. It's not an editable type of geometry. And this might be a bit advanced for now, but just to answer your question, if I use the same, don't worry too much about what I'm doing now. I'm just trying to change the video. So you see, if I change the texture to be the same as the other wall, and then I scale this cube, it's going to get bigger as well, right? So if I was to scale it, stretch it, yes, the texture would stretch along with it. And that's actually normal. That's the way you kind of want it to be. Right now, it looks ugly because we have a texture that ties. But if this was, let's say, a mesh of a rock, you kind of want the rock texture to scale along with the mesh, right? Because otherwise, it would remain like the rock texture would remain small, but then your rock object would be gigantic, if you know what I mean. Does that make sense, Neil?
Yep. Thank you for answering.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So there's no more question. I'm just gonna keep going making walls. So as I've shown you, a few ways to duplicate an object. You can use duplicate function here, or you can hold the Alt key and the gizmo, kind of move it, creates a copy. And I can rotate it 90 degrees, kind of place it here. Yep, cool. And I can hold the Alt key again, drag it to the side. Now I've got my third wall. So Lira, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Circular objects. Yep, you can create them. So in the geometry tab here, you can see there's a bunch of other ones. There's a sphere as well. It's not a very good looking sphere. By the way, when you drop an object in viewport, check out the details panel because there's a few options for each different shape. And you see that here, the brush shape, you can actually change the shape from here. Like if, let's say, oh, I don't want it to be a sphere anymore, to be a cylinder, I can just select it. And then you can change, let's say I want it to have more sides because I want it to look like a pipe, I can add 32 sides, and now you can see it's a bit small. But anyway, yes, you can create circular objects. We're going to go through physics a little bit today. We're not going to do anything advanced, but we're going to look at the basics concept just so you guys have like an understanding of how it works. Does that answer your question, Lara?
Yes, thank you very much.
Is it Lara or Lira?
It's Lera with yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good risk. So when you select an object, the first way to do it is to right click, edit, duplicate, or you can just Control W. If I select it and hit Control W, you can see that it's created a second one here. If I move it, I now have two walls. So that's the first way. The second way is you select your original object and you use the gizmo here. Just like if you were going to move that object. So if I move the object like that, it's it moved, right? But if I move the object while holding the Alt key on the keyboard, that's the key. It's the Alt key. If I hold that and then move, you can see it's created a second copy. That's how you know what I mean, Chris? All right, cool. So I now have three different walls. I don't know if they're totally enough. I'll do a trick I'll show you guys. So when you hit the play button, it's going to start the character where this object is placed. This is called the player start. If you look in the details panel, it says player start. The player start is used to indicate to the game where the player should start. Right? But if I don't want to start from here, because it's annoying, it's looking this way, I don't want to look at that. You can actually just right click anywhere, viewport. Let's say I want to start. I can right click here and you can select this option over there that says play from. And that's going to ignore the player start. Just as you can see, start the character at the location where. But anyway, I'm just checking the height of the wall that it's high enough. That looks high enough. Now I'm going to create a second floor. Where I do that, I basically just create new box, right? geometry mode. I'm gonna not that high, so I just drop it down. Cool. I can stretch the sides. Just gonna try and go a little bit faster. Done. Right now, I'm just stretching the sides because I want to make the second floor. Right? Something to keep in mind when you're in geometry edit mode and you want to move the whole brush, not just one face, just go back to place mode. Like leave geometry, like exit geometry editing, go back to place, and you can see that the cube switches back to just being an object, and then you can drag it to the whole object.
Hey, just a question.
Yeah.
Is it possible to fuse multiple geometry boxes or no?
What do you mean by freezing?
So like, so for example, I have one box that's additive and one box that's subtractive.
Mhm.
I'm going to put the subtractive box in the additive one and then fuse them together so I only have one object.
Yes and no. I'll show you that when I get to the additive part. So remind me if I forget, but I'll show you how to do that in just a minute.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I've created the second floor, and now what I want to do is the staircase. So if I go to geometry and select linear stair, drag that over here. Let's say we're gonna put it there. You can see that it's not high enough, right? So how do I change the height? Well, if you look in the details panel over there on the right, and scroll down a little bit to the brush settings, there's like a lot of settings you can change, the length and the height of each step, the width. That's not really what we want. All we care about is the number of steps. Right now we only have 10 steps. Let's try with 20. You can see it's a bit higher now. That looks a bit better. So I'm just gonna move it this way a little bit. So cool. So now I have a stair, but the problem is that there's a floor in the way. So how do I, dig a hole here? How do I carve that out? Well, that's where the subtractive geometry comes into play. So if you remember at the beginning, I was saying you can add geometry, but you can also subtract geometry. And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to add a box top. Right? You can see that box here is intersecting with the floor. Okay, so I'm just going to place it at the top of the stairs, right here. Right? Just align it. Now you'll see what happens when I do. Actually, I might have to scale it. So I'm just going to edit. So it's just flush floor. Yes. So now I have this little cube that I'm just gonna make it bigger because we kind of want to get. So you see that now I have the shape that I want, but it's not carving a hole here. To make it subtractive, go back to place mode so that I'm not in geometry. Just select the brush. And you can see in the brush options, you scroll down brush setting. You can change the brush type from additive to subtractive. And look what's going to happen now. I click subtract. There you go. So the geometry of that box has now been subtracted from every other geometry that it was intersecting. Now we have staircase, opening. We could actually probably walk to the top. Try that. And there you go. It's working. Carve the hole, made your entrance. All good. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so the brush setting, if you select your brush in the details panel on the right, you just basically scroll down properties until you get to brush settings category. And then there's a brush type property. You just change that from, it used to be additive, change it from additive to subtractive. And that's going to make a subtractive brush. Is that right, Simon? Find it? To answer the previous question, sorry, I can't remember who's asking. Um, Basically, if you want to make two brushes one object, there's not really a way to freeze them like the way you describe it. But if you select both of them, let's say you select the subtractive brush and the additive brush, these two guys, you can actually right click on it and okay, well, so you select both of them, and then in the world outliner on the right, if you right click on it, you see there's a group function. So if you hit that, uh, it may not look like it, but now these two objects are grouped together. So that technically there's still two different objects, but it's just that when you click on it, it's going to select both of them. So you see it's grouped. It's created
Oh,
this group actor here, and this group actor basically contains two brushes.
okay, so that's basically how the fusing is done in this circumstance.
It's not technically a freezing. Um, this just grouped it. There is an actual freezing like
Okay.
other things. Like let's say this floor here, I could freeze it if you right click on it and you transform. You can tick lock actor movement,
Okay. Yeah.
and that's an actual freeze. You can see that now I can't even move it.
Okay. And also with the grouping,
Yeah.
suppose you select one of the objects. Do both objects now move by the when you automatically select it, or do you have to select the group actor every time?
Sorry, could you say that again?
So suppose you select one of the objects that are in the group. Is every other single object in that group added to it, or no? When you select one object.
Well, the thing is, once you group objects together,
Yeah.
You cannot select just one of them. As you can see,
Okay.
when I click, it always selects both. Right?
Okay, so it auto selects everything inside the group.
Sorry, say again.
So it auto selects everything inside the group.
Yeah, it always selects everything, like
Ah,
all the objects in the group.
thank you.
You can still select just one if you need by right clicking, and in the groups menu, you can do unlock, and temporarily it will allow you to select just one, two, and
Okay,
then you can right click again and say lock. Now it selects both.
sweet. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to know.
So Reese, if you've duplicated the floor, yes, it's not going to work because the floor, it's hard to notice, but the floor is actually not geometry. The floor is a mesh. If you look in the details panel, you can see that the properties are different from the brushes that we've created. You know, the geometry is called the brush. You see the icon is like a cube, right? But if you click on the floor, that's a mesh. You can see the icon is different. It's like your house. And so it's what I was showing before when you drag one of these cubes that look different. It's because it's a mesh. It's not editable geometry. So the floor that's here by default when you create a new level, that floor is not geometry. It's a mesh, and it cannot you cannot edit the geometry that. So yeah, Reese, if you basically just remove that one you've duplicated, the floor, and then replace that with an actual geometry box, it's gonna work. So yeah, I think we now have some kind of level. Brushes are mesh auto applied. It's a bit more complicated. I'm not sure what you call a mesh, but yeah, the brushes are basically a geometry shape that gets filled with geometry. And in other softwares, this might be called a mesh, but in Unreal, a mesh is something that has static geometry that you cannot edit. This one here that we call editable geometry, it's a completely different type of geometry. So I'm not really sure how to answer your question, but basically, when you make a brush, it does, yes, automatically get some kind of visual that you could call a mesh, but it's not a mesh type. So yeah, moving on. We now have a level. We can make a few windows. We want to be fancy. So I'm gonna add another box here. Gonna align it like a window. I'm gonna use the scale on that one because I don't care about the texture. I just want to carve a hole. Kind of here. Yep, it's going through the wall. I'm just gonna change on the right side here from additive subtractive. Bam, got a window. Sweet. Um, Note that you can also duplicate subtractive brushes. If I was to take that subtractive brush and then copy it, if I hold the Alt key, drag it, copy, and I drop it here, it's automatically subtracted on the other side as well. So now I have two subtractive brushes, as you can see. I've created. So it doesn't look amazing, but it's functional. We have it. Yeah. So Hamish, I'm not sure what kind of mesh you're referring to, but it's not the case here. Something that you can go through. I don't. All right, cool. Okay, so I'm gonna move on. Hopefully, you guys have had time to make a bit of a better level than what I did. That's fine. So now we have a level. We can play along, we can navigate. That's all good. Overall, it didn't take that long. That's a good base to start with. So the next thing I want to talk about is lighting. So that's a pretty important point, especially for you guys in BSE. Once you start working on a project with, let's say, people from BCT or like artists, they're going to want to make everything super pretty, super good looking. So they're gonna add like crap load of lights everywhere. And depending on how the lighting is set up, it can be something that is very expensive performance wise if it's set up the wrong way. So that's why I want to look at it here so that you guys have basic knowledge of different types of lighting setup and which ones are cheap, which ones are expensive, which ones should be used in most cases. Of course, it depends on the kind of game you're making, but there are, best practices that we try and look at today. Let's do this. Yeah, Reese, I'll show you real quick. So when you're subtracting, you're subtracting through another brush. If you only have one brush, then it's fine because you can find it easily. But if you're subtracting through multiple things, like the staircase, for example, yeah, so it kind of depends on the order that you've created the brush. So what I mean is, if let's say we've created the brush before the roof or before the staircase, then the brush, because it's intersecting with different meshes, we just think, oh, I'm just going to subtract with the most recent one, right? But you can change that. So let's say if you right click on your subtractive brush and go in,
Just one more question.
yeah,
For the subtractive boxes, can you make it so that it only subtracts certain objects?
yeah,
So
that's
suppose suppose like for example, like I suppose say like you got one box on the left, one box on the right. You put a subtractive object in the middle, but you only want to subtract the object on the right. Is it possible to do that?
no, you can't tell it to ignore certain brushes. The thing you
Okay.
can do is change. That's what I was going to show here. Change the order find where this is. I haven't. Sorry, guys. Um, oh, I guess I'll have to get back to you on that one because I can't find the freaking option. Anyway, maybe you can find it while I keep going. There's an option somewhere on that brush, and I can't remember if it's in the right click or if it's in the details somewhere here. But you can change the order, and the order you can change to last or to first, and the order, or maybe it's here. There you go, that guy. So, okay, so I'll rewind a little. Select your subtractive brush, and then you scroll down the settings, brush settings, and you see by default there's that tiny little arrow here that hides some of the advanced settings. You click on that to show advanced settings. You'd have more options at the bottom. If you click on order, you can select to first or to last. You see what that does. Let's say to first. See that now it's not carving a wall anymore. But then if I do to last, it's carving. Why is that? Because when it does because it's a Boolean operation, right? It will look at when it's intersecting with different meshes. It will look at the, the number of meshes in an order, right? It's basically making a list of every meshes that are intersecting, and it's kind of taking these meshes in order of creation. So if you have a problem like you're describing, like, oh, it's not carving my stairs, but it's carving wall, you might have to, probably not on the subtractive brush, but maybe on the additive brush, change the order, be first or last. Like try to play around with these and it might solve your problem. There you go. Awesome. All right. So back to lighting. Yeah, so in Unreal, you have more or less two different types of lighting setup. You can set up a static lighting, or you can set up dynamic lighting. Now, your reflex might be to say, well, I'm going to go dynamic because I want stuff to move around and change color and everything. Sure, but it has a cost, right? And you'll find that games, everything comes back to performance eventually. You could go crazy and add like thousands of features and make everything dynamic, everything like crazy. But if it doesn't run, there's no point. So that's why I want to show you the pros and cons of both setups. So what do I mean by static? Dynamic lighting means that your lights can move, can be moved, can be toggled on and off, can change color, can change intensity. That basically all your lighting setup can be modified when the game is running. That's what dynamic means. Static means that all the lighting information cannot be changed at runtime, right? So the pros of the static setup is that basically it's extremely performant. It has zero cost. It's free. So that's, you see that this is basically the main reason why that's the most common setup. It's because it has no cost. The second good thing is that it supports something that we call global illumination. What does that mean, global illumination? It's basically the indirect lighting, bounce lighting. So when you think about, the sun hitting your room through the window, the light actually bounces on your wall multiple times, right? So when the sun goes through your window, it doesn't just only light the wall that's right in front of it. It actually lights your whole room, even though it's not directly looking at every single wall of your room. right? Because the light bounces, and so your whole room gets lit, even though the sun is only directly touching one wall. If that kind of makes sense. Um, like, don't worry too much. Don't understand 100%. Um, Global illumination just basically means that get way more accurate, realistic lighting because the lighting is bouncing around the level. Another pro is that you can adjust it for much higher. The prime is that it will take longer to build. Get back to what that means in a second. And then the shadows in a static lighting setup are nice and soft. They look way better than the cons of a static setup is that, as the name indicates, the lights cannot be moved or toggled at runtime. The shadows of objects are actually baked into a light map. So the static. What does that mean? Baked into a light map is that it means that the shadows of objects are saved into a texture that we call light map. And that texture basically contains all the lighting information of a level. And that texture is basically applied on top of every single object to make it look like they have and lighting. I just finished this Lyra and then get back to you in a second. Another con is that you have to build, so you know that light map, that texture I just talked about, you have to build it for every level. You know, it's automatic, Unreal can do it for you, but it's something that you have to, it's a process that you have to start for every level, and it kind of takes time. The other cons, and that's something that if you guys can remember that would be great, that when you have a static lighting setup, the meshes in your level need to have a specific UV channel for the light maps for these textures to be inserted in. If you don't know what a UV channel is right now, it's not too important. What's important is that if you're working with an artist, they need to understand that when they make mesh, Max or Maya or whatever, and they import it in Real, they need to set up this specific UV channel for the light maps. They should know what it means because that's their job. But it's important for you to also know that the light maps will require meshes that artists make to be set up in a specific way. Unreal can set it up automatically, but they just need to tick that box. So Lyra, so what you're asking is a little bit advanced. Like we're going to look today at how to make a field. If you mean like a terrain, like a landscape, then yes, we'll look at that a little bit later on. How to change the sky to be more like space and stars. I wasn't going to show it, but if we have time after this lecture, please remind me and I'll show you real quick how to do it. It's pretty easy. At least it's easy to make it do like stars. Moon or acidic trip, that's a bit more advanced. It's not something I can show you in like 5 minutes. So yeah, we're gonna look at the field. For the sky, just remind me after the lecture. Okay, so moving on to dynamic setup. Basically, the pros of the full dynamic setup is that all your lights can move, can change value, can be toggled on and off, can have crazy animation, they can flicker, all that stuff. You can also have dynamic shadows, which the static setup does not support. So let's say if you have a character and you want that character to have a shadow, then you would need some kind of dynamic light to cast that shadow, right? Because you know the character will be moving, so the shadow also needs to be moving. The character. Of course, the cons of a dynamic setup is that it does not support global illumination. So you know that kind of light bouncing around that I was talking about. Also, dynamic is extremely expensive at runtime, especially the dynamic shadows. That's the most expensive part of the dynamic lighting. So you know, if you're ever working on a game and you see that the performance are crap, kind of wondering why, there's a pretty high chance that it's going to be because you have a lot of dynamic shadows. Another con is that the shadows, dynamic shadows, are not extremely high quality, so they're very sharp, not soft like in real life. There's also some hardware limitation for dynamic lighting. So you probably notice really quickly when you start adding lights in a level that your lights start the icons start changing, and it turns into like a red cross telling you that you have too many lights overlapping. What that means is that there's a maximum number of dynamic lights that can be intersecting, and that's a hardware limitation that you have to work around. I'm going to try and go a little bit faster, so if it's too fast for you, please let me know.
Just one more thing about the lights.
Yeah.
Is it possible to have dynamic and static lights in the same,
Yes.
for example, level?
Yes, definitely. So that's actually the most common setup, is to have like a mix of both. And
Okay,
I'll
yeah.
talk about that just in the next slide after this.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So one concept that's really important when we talk about lighting is the concept of movability. Movability, if you look, mobility. Mobility is a setting that you can find on lights and any actor. Well, so if I switch back to Unreal, you can see that if I select the floor and scroll all the way back up, I've got that mobility setting here. And you can see it says static, stationary, or movable. And that's basically how you can decide your lighting setup. And, like question you were asking, that's also how you can decide to mix static lighting and dynamic. Because, for some objects like my character, I want it to have a dynamic shadow, right? Otherwise, it'd be like the 90s again. So I do want my character to be dynamic. And so to do that, I can just set my character to be movable because I want him to move. I want him to have, dynamic light on him, and I also want dynamic shadow to be cast. But if you look at the rest of the level, like my walls, I don't care for these walls to be dynamics. They're not going to move. So they can have static lights. They can have static shadows. I don't need these to be updated when the game is running. So this is kind of what that thing here is showing you. You don't need to remember every single setting. It's just to give you an overview. But basically, when you change that type on an actor, or actor, by the way, means an object in the level. On actors or lights, it means different things, whether it's an actor or a light. So static, whether it's for an actor or light, basically means there's not going to be any dynamic shadow. It cannot change or move. Also, we're going to be calculating a light map texture, right? So, like I was saying before, a light map is a texture that's calculated by the engine to store lighting and shadow information, and that's applied to the actor to make it look like it has lighting and shadow. There's that one here called stationary. So you see it's the one in the middle, and it's kind of a hybrid between static and dynamic. So stationary means um, for for an actor, for example. So let's start at the light first. So if you set a light to be stationary, what that means is that yes, the light will still be static, but the settings can change. For example, you can at runtime change the color, change the intensity, things like that. But it will still be casting static shadows on static objects, but it will cast dynamic shadows on dynamic objects. And this is why we have two columns, right? We have the actors column and the lights column. So that if you have a light that's set to stationary, it will know that it needs to behave differently for an actor that's static and an actor that's movable. Consider movable to be dynamic, basically. So yeah, stationary is kind of a hybrid. And an actor that's set to stationary um, means that it can have some kind of dynamic lighting and dynamic shadows, but it still can. And then the last category is movable, so basically fully dynamic. Movable means the actor can move. It can have dynamic lighting, dynamic shadows. You can change any setting. That's basically. So you see quite often that any object that needs to move, like character, will be set to move. And actually, the engine will give you an error if you're trying to move something that is not set. So I'm going quickly here, just so you have a basic knowledge of it, and you don't need to remember all these exact settings. That's just for your reference. So if you do work with lighting again at some point, just go back to this slide, take a look. There's also a link at the bottom here to the official documentation that has a bit more information. What all of these mean. Okay, so light types. Just gonna do this and then we can take a break after that. So different types of lights. You have the first one you have is a directional light. So directional light simulates a light that's being emitted from a source that's really, really far away, and only the facing direction matters. So basically, only the rotation of that light matters. The position doesn't matter because once again, it's simulating a source that's infinitely far away. But the good thing with the directional light is that all the shadows will be parallel. So that's why we use the directional light basically to simulate the sun in most cases. Then you have your point light, which basically works like a light bulb, going to emit light in every single direction, right? Like a sphere shape. That's like the most common type. Then you have the spotlight, as as the name indicates, it basically emits light in a cone kind of shape this way. And then you have the skylight. The skylight is kind of like a special type of light that tries to replicate the lighting from the atmosphere. So how it does that is it captures the very far edge of the levels, and it tries to capture all the colors from that edge and applies that to the lighting. So you can just think about that as like a light that's going to simulate the color from the sky, right? If you're doing an outdoor. Something to keep in mind is that when you place a light in the level, by default, it's going to be set to stationary. And you have to be very careful. I don't know why this is the default. But remember that stationary is a hybrid between static and dynamic. So this means if you're adding like hundreds of lights everywhere, you're going to have dynamic shadows everywhere. So you have to be careful, place lights to remember to set their mobility to static. Right. So we're gonna look at that in a second. We get to placing lights. I'll finish this quickly and then when it comes to building, so basically the most common setup really is a mix of static and dynamic. But even though it's a mix of both, it's still like 90% static lighting. And static lighting, remember, needs to be built. We need to calculate that light map texture for the whole level and apply it to every single mesh in our levels, make it look like they have lighting and shadow, right? So how that's done, it's pretty easy. It's automated. So all you need to do is to add a volume, as you can see here on the screenshot. You just add a volume that surrounds your whole level. That volume just basically tells Unreal where to focus its efforts. It will probably work if you don't add a volume, but it might take longer and the quality might not be. So this just tells Unreal, focus in this area. And then the other thing you need to remember is to set all your lights to static ability, unless you really need them to be. but basically most of your lights should be set to static. And then you just hit the build button that's at the top in the level editor. When you hit that button, it's going to do a few things. It's going to start building geometry, do a few things like that. And then it's going to start that weird window that you see here. This is called Swarm Agent. What that does, Swarm Agent, is by default, it doesn't do much. It just tries to calculate that light map texture for you. But if you set it up right, like let's say we were at school right now, we set up Swarm Agent. What that could do is that it could distribute the workload between different computers on the network. So basically what Swarm Agent does, speeds up the process quite a lot if you set it up to share the work between different computers. It's kind of like a render farm. So if you hit the build button, you start Swarm Agent, and if you're connected with other computers, it will start sharing the work between different computers. And once this is done, we'll send all the information back to Unreal, and Unreal will apply the texture. So that's kind of how it works. I'm going a bit fast, I'm sorry, but just so you guys have like a general idea how it works. Yeah, follow along. So that maybe let's take a break first. It's already 10. So let's have a 10-minute break. Is that enough for you guys?
Do you mind if I'll ask a question about more about Unreal Engine for in this break?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. First of all, I still would like to know how to change background, like from sky to stars and everything.
Mhm.
Yes. Would you mind to explain it?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'll show you that after the lecture.
Yes.
That's all right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And another, my question was about next submission, and I want to ask it to you because it heavily like involves just 3D modeling and everything. As far as I know, we will have to design a level in Unreal Engine for our next submission, and I was just wondering if, for example, I have a friend who is doing 3D modeling, and if I ask this friend to provide 3D models, would it be acceptable? And if it would be acceptable, what file extension for Unreal Engine is?
So I don't really know about the details of your submission. You have to ask Sama for that.
Mm-hmm.
So, Lara, we're going to talk in details about the summative after we finish the lecture. So the summative is not going to be till next week. So next week, we're going to give you all the details that you need. Do not worry about that now.
Yeah, it's just I'm really keen to start and curious about everything.
Yeah, that's okay. But to answer the second part of your question, if you have assets or meshes that have been made in other softwares, it's extremely easy to import that in Unreal. And in the next part of the lecture, we're going to look at how to import that.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, let's have a 10-minute break. Is that enough for everyone?
Yeah. Hey, Chris, with the brush being subtractive, I've changed the order and it's still not removing the roof.
Okay. In that case, you might have to change the order of the other brush. So the